Hello and welcome back to another episode of Activist. I'm Gareth.
And I'm Jackie.
Today we have a very special episode for you with the leading freshwater ecologist, Dr. Mike Joy.
Mike is one of my heroes, I have to say, and he is known throughout New Zealand for campaigning tirelessly to get people to wake up and see what animal agriculture is doing to our environment, our wildlife and our health.
Yeah, in this episode we have a brilliant discussion about how factory farming is used out here, even though it's outdoors. New Zealand's system is basically an outdoor factory farm, and we are absolutely destroying our country and destroying our planet, and worse yet, causing these animals to suffer in an outdoor environment. So
exactly. He's got a vision for 2021, and this is why we wanted to share it to you, because it's very important, and Mike has so much enlightening stuff to say. You know, it's a must watch. It really is.
He's a brilliant advocate and ally for our movement, and it's so great to have him bring his vision to us. And so if you enjoy this episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can check out the rest of our activist series. Leave a like on this if you enjoy it, and drop a comment if you've learned something from it. We always love seeing your feedback. So.
And there is so much to learn in this episode. We'll be blown away.
It's a brain buster. So we really hope you enjoy this episode. Dr. Mike Joy, it is an absolute pleasure to have you with us here today. To many of us here in New Zealand, you're widely recognised as one of our prominent voices for the environment. For the benefit of our viewers from all around the world, however, could you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University. Previous to that, I was a lecturer in freshwater ecology and environmental science at Massey University, and did that for about 20 years. But I was a late starter to academia. I mean, I first went to university at the age of 33. So I had a whole other life of dairy farming and worked on a outback sheep station and built boats and sailed the Pacific and did all manner of jobs before I got into this world. So pretty kind of diverse background. Unlike a lot of academics that I work with, who seem to go straight from school to uni and stay there forever, kind of thing. So I think that's maybe explains why I'm a bit different from the rest of them.
Oh, well, you've definitely been making up for lost time when it comes to having an impact on what you're doing now. As Gareth mentioned, you know, you're very well known in New Zealand for raising your voice and speaking the truth about some of our main environmental issues in this country. And, you know, we're always being marketed as this clean, green haven of a nation. Could you tell us a little bit how this sort of false propaganda got you to not only enroll in university, but sort of become the self-described angry advocate that you are today?
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't realise this till later on, but I kind of had this really deep belief, having been brought up as a Kiwi, that we were so, you know, lucky to live in this clean, green country. And it's certainly, you know, when I was a kid, it was a lot, you know, more accurate than what it is now. I mean, we've done an incredible amount of damage in the last, you know, 50, 60 years. And so, and so it's that anger, it's that feeling that, the more, I mean, I was never an angry, speaking up type person. I was a very shy, retiring person until I started studying this and studying freshwater particularly, and native fish was what I was working on for a start. And the anger came from the realization is just how fast that we were trashing everything that we have. You know, how unique our fauna is, and to think that we are just as bad or probably worse than many other developed countries in the world when it comes to destroying our freshwaters, our atmosphere, our oceans, you know, you name it. We're shocking. We have shocking statistics for waste, you know, the amount of fertilizer used, all those kind of things. We're in the bottom 20 percentile. Of 170, 80 countries in the world that you can get data from, we're right there with the very worst in the world on most of the things: water quality, fertilizer use, marine captures, you know, greenhouse gas emissions per capita, all of that kind of stuff. We are shockers. Yeah.
I always find it absolutely bizarre that this country as well, it likes to be known for being a front runner, you know, like we have the best rugby team, we have the best of this, the best of that. And like, especially in recent times, you know, with the pandemic, everyone's praising New Zealand. Oh, what a wonderful thing. You're putting the right foot forward. But for me personally, I kind of feel we should also be putting ourselves up there and sort of saying, you know, look how many things we are doing terribly, how many things we're doing really wrong. And especially like you just mentioned before, we are number 2 in the most polluted lakes and rivers, is it? Just behind China. And also we have the number 1 statistics for colorectal cancer in the world. So we're really outdoing ourselves as a tiny nation of getting ourselves up the top of those billboards. But can you tell us? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say we like to celebrate the good stuff, and we are very good at just covering up the bad stuff and not talking about it. And it's, I mean, that's a big part of my fight and struggle and anger is the government, central and local government organisations that supposedly are supposed to be protecting freshwater and environment in New Zealand, and how complicit they are in not doing that, and in fact, and worse, in covering it up.
Absolutely, yeah. It was shocking. I saw something that you posted the other day, like Gareth was saying, I think it was the 10 most polluted lakes in the world. And New Zealand had 4 of those in that list. I could not believe it. I mean, that's a real eye-opener.
Oh, that was the rivers. That was nitrate loadings in rivers in the world. Yeah, and I mean, that's a selection, and we are amongst the worst. We've taken a very natural farming system and turned it into an industrial system. And it kind of gets into a really, really tricky space because people, I mean, we can talk about this in detail if you want to, but people imagine that because, and we market our dairy products and a lot of our food as being wonderful because, it's grass-based, the cows are outside, as if that's a really, really good thing when it's better than a feedlot. But the problem with having that intensity of cows outside, and when I say that intensity, it's the intensity, the stocking rate that's way higher than natural because we pour on these artificial fertilizers, and then the fertilizers, the nitrogen especially, just goes straight through them, and very little goes away with the product. A little bit goes into the meat, a little bit goes into the milk, but the vast majority of it goes out into the environment where it causes all sorts of harm and nitrous oxide to the atmosphere, which is 300 times more of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is, and huge problems with the water that relates back to the cancers and all the other human health issues as well as ecosystem health ones. So yeah, this is kind of marketed by the companies as a positive thing, but not in reality, not a positive thing at all.
Yeah, I think what was the word for it? Constructive accounting comes up quite a bit with a lot of these things. And a recent talk you were doing as well, you're saying about how with the overstocking, there's about 5 million of us here in New Zealand, human-wise, but with the cattle, they're doing the equivalent of 150 million.
140
million people's worth of waste.
That's a minimum. So so if you look at all the things that from the amount of waste, or how much nitrogen's in it, or how much E. coli pathogens in it, all that kind of things, it's between 14 and 44 human equivalents per large cattle beast. And so there's about 10 million cattle in this country, 6.5 million dairy cows, and the rest are beef. And so, it's just simple. 10 times 14 is 140 million minimum human equivalents in those animals. And at least in our case, a lot of that waste is captured and, supposedly treated. Actually, we don't do very well at treating it, but at least we have a go at it. Whereas what's happening out in the paddock is that the urine full of nitrate is just going straight through and into soils, and then into waterways, and then into oceans. And so, it's trying to understand that the difference with New Zealand. It was the same thing over the lockdown, that there was this, lots of stats coming from overseas, how skies were clearing over China and really intensively humanized parts of the world, and so that it was great for the environment. But here in New Zealand, nothing changed really. I mean, people went inside. That didn't make any difference to the human. There would have been a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from transport and that kind of thing. But the farming system just chugged along exactly as it was before, and no reduction at all in waste production and harm coming from that intensive agriculture.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about, we were saying yesterday when doing research and things like that similarity between advocating for change for the animals and advocating for change for the environment is that we're so often fighting against issues which aren't visible to the general public. Just as we can't see the atrocities that are inflicted on livestock on a daily basis, we also can't see the damage that's happening to our waterways every day as a result of animal agriculture. So could you explain for our viewers the effect of nitrogen on our waterways and subsequently our drinking water? Because I was really shocked to find out, about the state of our drinking water.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the trouble. I get frustrated with this. There's a big kind of commission going on in New Zealand. They're talking about the three waters. So we have stormwater, we have wastewater, that comes out of water treatment plants, and we have drinking water. And they think that they can this all comes out of the big poisoning in Havelock North, where 5,000 people got seriously ill from contaminated drinking water. And so they did this big inquiry, and this is what comes out of it. But it's typical of a government response in that they narrow down on these three waters and forget the big water or the fourth water or whatever, the source water. And, as if the only waters that count are these ones that we manipulate at one end, and not thinking about how we've polluted the water, which is the water that supplies the groundwater, that supplies the drinking water for much of New Zealand. And that, so you get this kind of crazy situation. But anyway, so nitrate, what nitrate does, and the bulk of it coming from, which I already touched on before, from nitrogen fertilizer that comes from fossil fuels. This is a crucial part of the whole story, to understand that up until 1980 in New Zealand, we didn't have any nitrogen fertilizer. It was part of a whole process where we took gas off, natural gas. We were forced to take it. We had a take or pay scheme where an overseas company came in, said, yep, we'll find gas and oil in your country and we'll supply it to you, but we have to make a profit. We have to sell X amount. So this was this take or pay scheme. You take it, you're going to pay for it anyway. So the government had to run around and come up with ways of using this gas, because they were being forced to use it at this really high rate. So they came up with, one of the uses was the Kapuni plant that turned it into urea fertilizer or nitrogen fertilizer. So then they had a product that they had to push on farmers in New Zealand, and they very successfully did. Now only 1/3 of it comes from New Zealand gas, and the rest comes from Middle East. And this massive amount of nitrogen fertilizer that grows grass, most of it, as I said, leaves the farm. It doesn't stay on the farm. It doesn't go to the product. It doesn't go to the animal. It goes out and through the urine and into groundwater, rivers, streams, drinking water. And I mean, I think the classic case is Canterbury, where all of the drinking water comes from that groundwater, and it's very shallow, gravelly soils, and you get a very, very quick movement from what happens on the land, sped up by irrigation, I might add, pumping it through the system. So what nitrate does in the ecosystem is it does exactly what it did on the paddock. You put it on the paddock to grow grass, it ends up in water, and it grows plants. So whether it's starting in the rivers, it grows algae, which covers the bed of the waterway. It ends up in lakes, and it grows weed, and it grows algae in lakes, and offshore it grows big algal blooms as well, and we have dead zones. And in all of those cases, the initial harm, or one of the most common harms, is the effect on dissolved oxygen. So when you have plants, everyone I think knows from school about photosynthesis and that process of taking in carbon dioxide and respiring and giving out oxygen. And so what happens that happens diurnally, so at night it goes in reverse and it's using up the oxygen. So you get really depleted oxygen levels during the night and early morning, and really excessive oxygen levels during the day. In a healthy system with a healthy amount of nutrient, which is just a natural amount, then the oxygen levels are constant and everything's fine. It's just when you add all this nutrient to the system, then it starts to fluctuate. Oxygen levels start to fluctuate, and you get deficits where nothing can survive it. Well, I mean, I think the best way for people to understand is if they've seen a goldfish in a little bowl at home and you see goldfish gulping air off the surface, that's because there's not enough oxygen in the water. So some of the fish species, especially the ones like goldfish that are evolved to low oxygen conditions, can take some from the surface and survive, but most of our native fish can't do that, and so they die, and same with the invertebrates. So that's the ecosystem level effect, and it just gets exacerbated through the lakes and oceans, and you have all the life dying off in these things called dead zones. What happens, well, but when it comes to human health, there are a bunch of illnesses associated with high nitrogen or nitrate levels in drinking water. One of the ones that's been studied quite a bit, and particularly recently, is colorectal cancer. So, I mean, people, and I guess that a lot of your listeners will be aware of nitrite effects on the body. So those processed meats and things like that, and the nitrite relationship with cancers, with things like salamis and processed and bacon and that kind of thing. Well, what happens with nitrate in drinking water is the body converts it to nitrite, and the effects are very, very similar. So there's some big studies from Denmark, from USA, and I mean studies involving many, many millions of people, showing really clear relationships between increasing nitrate levels in drinking water and colorectal cancer. And when we look at New Zealand, where we have the highest rates in the world, so it's colorectal cancer is the number two killer globally as far as cancers. You rank the cancers and it's number two. I'm not sure what's number one, I forget. But then in New Zealand, we have the highest rates in New Zealand. And when you look at where the highest rates are in New Zealand, there's a very high correlation with high nitrate in drinking water and the highest rates within New Zealand. And there's a bunch more work being done on that. There's a couple of papers that are in the process of being published at the moment, so I'll be able to be more specific about those numbers. But I can just generalize at the moment that that's the kind of issue, and it's very plain when you look at the nitrate levels in groundwater in intensively farmed areas. It's high and increasing, and it doesn't always, Canterbury is the example where it happens really, really fast. In other parts of the country, it can take decades from the time the nitrate starts to move through the soil until it ends up in the waterways. So sort of a matter of a few days or years in Canterbury, and decades in other parts of the country. So, I mean, I guess, I'm just mentioning that because, just to kind of remind people that you can kind of shut off the supply, but you're not going to see the impacts drop off straight away. This is a legacy effect that's going to keep on coming for a while.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
My mum, she's actually a bowel cancer survivor, and she's living in the heart of rural Waikato, surrounded by farmland. So when I heard all this from you, I was like, well, that makes total sense. Can you please stop drinking so much water, Mum?
Well, yeah, I mean, now we get into this other issue that really gets me angry, is that, so, I probably, I can't be sure, but I mean, you could guess quite easily that at Fonterra and Dairy New Zealand, they might have a picture of me on the dartboard. But at Coca-Cola, I imagine that I'm their number one best seller, because they would love me, because as I point out the harm that people can, the potential harm of drinking water that's supplied to New Zealanders, then the immediate reaction is, if you're worried about it at all, is to go and buy bottled water. And there's a whole lot of issues with bottled water, the plastic bottles that it's put in. But the problem, the thing that makes me really angry about that is that we have these transnational companies like Coca-Cola who, for zero cost, get to take the best water. I mean, as far as I know, most of their drinking water comes from Patauru. They've got a bore in Patauru that's very, very deep, where the water hasn't been contaminated yet. So they get that for nothing, and then they get to sell it to us and put it in plastic bottles and sell it to us at an incredible profit. And the reason they get it for nothing is because all of the governments up until now, and including this current one, are too scared to take on the issue of water ownership. So it's much easier and safer for a government to just go, oh, nobody owns water. The famous, John Key lines, nobody owns water in New Zealand. Now, the reason they say that is because they haven't and won't face up to the treaty issues around the ownership of water in New Zealand, and so it's a complete cop-out from them. So when they say nobody owns water in New Zealand, you just have to, and I suggest that anybody listening who wants to do this, have a look at, go online and look for Hydro Trader. I think it's just hydrotrader.com or something, but Hydro Trader New Zealand, and you'll see it's a bit like a stock market type thing where water takes in Canterbury are traded online. And there are millions of dollars worth of water being traded on this website. This is rights to water where people can make huge amounts of money, despite the fact that supposedly nobody owns water. Then it's traded for a huge amount of money. And those, it's not like anybody was asked, Māori or otherwise, if it's okay if those people get given this huge resource. It's just taken as a right because they own the land that you can put the bore down on that land, even though the catchment area for that groundwater that you're taking might be hundreds of kilometers away from you. You have the right to it. And so this is a whole, the other side of this story that, like, say for your mum, if you suggest to her, don't drink that tap water, she goes and buys it from Coca-Cola, which is just, it's so depressing and so sad that we are so gullible and stupid that that's what happens in this country.
Exactly.
Because when we first heard about your work, we were down in Southland ourselves, and we were watching the webinar called The Future of Food, which is absolutely brilliant, and we'll have to link it in the description of this video. But yeah, of course, we did that exact thing. We went and bought, some of those big gallon jugs of water and stuff, and the local farmer comes around and he's like, isn't that water good enough for you? And like, we were like, well, no, I don't want cancer.
Yeah.
But that lasted for I don't know, maybe a month or so. We did that, getting the big containers. But yeah, it's just, I guess is there a best of a bad bunch? Is it just a case of, if we eliminate, let's say, the meat products, which are given this nitrite to us, is that sort of the best that we can do is just by eliminating all other sources and just basically trying to work on the system on slowly get rid of that legacy?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a fan of just catching your own water. It falls out of the sky. It's pouring down here at the moment. You could catch quite easily a huge amount of water that's running at the moment. And I've lived most of my life in houses that did catch their own roof water, and so I'm a bit of a fan of it. But yeah, I mean, so there is that option. But yeah, I mean, I'm appalled to think that. And the government just recently announced they're going to put a huge amount more money into cleaning up water. The kind of idiocy of cleaning up something afterwards. So instead of it's just the classic ambulance. The thing that makes me mad about lots of what's happening in New Zealand. We spend huge amounts of money on ambulances for the bottom of the cliff, and we won't touch the source of the problem. We just had the classic thing that I'm still so angry about with Minister Parker, our environment minister, exempting a couple of key vegetable growing areas in New Zealand from having that the freshwater protections. They're very, very weak freshwater protections anyway, but for example, in the Horowhenua, one of the most polluted lakes in New Zealand and the world is Lake Horowhenua. But the government announced that one of the major inputs to that lake is the intensive horticulture that happens in the catchment of the lake, and it's been exempted from. And the minister said, and he was quoted on the radio as saying that that he had advice that there would be a reduction if they applied those limits to protect nitrate levels in fresh waters around that lake, around that region for the lake, then it would reduce vegetable production there, and Pukekohe was the other place they talked about, the other big vegetable area, would reduce production by 40%. Therefore, those two areas were going to be exempt. And he linked it to diet. He said because vegetables are very important in New Zealand's diet, New Zealanders' diets, and so we wouldn't want this to happen. So to invoke the diet thing when you're allowing the pollution of waterways that would harm people's health potentially, and then use the health card to try and justify not protecting fresh waters. Whoops. Sorry. As an excuse not to protect fresh waters is like just such a creepy double standard that that makes me really mad, because they put up some figure. The whole basis of it is completely fake. And I actually saw the advice that the minister was given, and it came from, and it appalls me to think that this happens in this country. It was from Ministry of Primary Industries, completely unreferenced. Some unnamed staff member in the Ministry of Primary Industries giving advice to the Minister for the Environment on this issue. Just basically made up numbers, no justification whatsoever, and that's where the 40% story came from. So they're kind of saying that it's okay. I mean, you guys probably know much better than me about the problems with intensively produced vegetables. They just don't have the goodness that when you pump in high levels of fertilizer and you farm in a monoculture like that. And the other thing that I know that they do is just before, maybe within days of harvest, they'll put on an extra big dose of nitrate of nitrogen fertilizer to give this kind of bloom or flush, like to broccoli and plants like that, so that they'll look good in the supermarket. And so it's, the whole process is stupidly industrial, but that's like the final, kind of stupidity, just to make it look like a flush of nice coloured green, and most of it washes off and ends up in the lakes and rivers and that kind of thing. So justifying producing vegetables as if that overrides everything, even though the quality of the vegetables is debatable, and you're going to harm the environment in that process, is just such flawed logic.
It's absolutely crazy.
It's insane, isn't it?
I kind of like to imagine it in my head, they're being handed like a crisp packet with the information written on, like, here's your official document.
Yeah. Oh, it's I mean, I hate that idea that, that's the advice that the government's getting, and it's just public servants, thinking they know what the minister wants to hear, kind of thing, and passing it on. That's a big problem with our system. So, but I mean, no matter how you look at that, because there's so many problems with it. So then all the vegetable producers who don't happen to be in Horowhenua or Pukekohe don't get that. They have to comply with the freshwater protection. And so you're going to protect just a certain number of vegetable growers because they happen to be the biggest and the noisiest and the best lobbyers, I guess. And then if you put a price on it, and which is what the dairy industry often does when they say, well, if you make us comply with these freshwater conditions, then it's going to cost X amount of dollars. Therefore, you have to look at that and say, okay, if it's going to cost, in the case of protecting Lake Ellesmere in Canterbury, I've got the figures for that, where the Ministry for the Environment got a report done on the economics of the cutting nitrogen use or intensity back to the level that would be required to protect that lake. And it's just not that many farms. It's only one lake. It would cost $300 million in lost profit for those dairy farms, right? So, or there was another alternative of buying land and creating a huge wetland to take up those nutrients before they got into the lake, and that was going to cost $390 million. So the council, supported by the Ministry for the Environment, said, no, okay, we obviously can't afford to protect Lake Ellesmere because it's going to cost $300 million. But surely, if it's going to cost $300 million to protect the lake, then that's per year, then we are subsidising, the rest of New Zealand, or that lake, or the people that use that lake, or however you want to look at it, are subsidising that industry to the tune of $300 million a year by allowing them to keep polluting that lake. I mean, I don't know if they realise it when they say it, but we have to turn that back on them. When they say, oh, we can't afford to have these freshwater protections because it'll cost $300 million. Well, tough, because otherwise we're just leaving it for our kids to have to pay. Well, they don't pay in cash, they pay in disease and sickness and in unhealthy rivers and all of that kind of thing. So I think, we really have to jump on that kind of stuff when it happens.
Oh, it's insanity. I mean, something that we were really gobsmacked and I was actually really angry to hear recently is that our government and taxpayers pay something like $40 million for farmers not to pollute two of our lakes alone, just Lake Rotorua and Taupo. It's bizarre any of us should even have to pay for this, but yet another thing that even comes even more absurd as well is how the government are also dealing with the pollution that's coming through by dumping aluminium into the lake to stop the algae from growing that you spoke about.
Yeah.
Could you enlighten us to why the hell they do this and if it even has a chance of keeping the water clean?
Okay, so the 40 million is just for Lake Rotorua. Lake Taupo already had 90 million. So it works out to $400 for every kilogram of nitrogen that's leached off a farm per year. So you go, so the 40 million, that's because you have to get 100 tons less nitrogen into Lake Rotorua to protect it, is the calculation, right? So the 100 tons works out at $40 million, works out to $400 for every kilogram. So that's, for the average farm, that's probably $6 million or something like that, that the farmer will be paid to not have those cows on that farm. And, you can say what you like about that, but at least it is working in that when those cows are gone, they're not allowed to put them back again. And so there is a chance that lake will come right. The fact, that we're taxpayers' money paying for it. And I mean, it's a tricky area. Some of the farmers could justifiably claim that they went into this blind, they paid good money for these cows in this land and then get told afterwards they can't do it, so therefore we should recompense them. That's a whole other argument. But to put that kind of into some kind of scale, if you look at Canterbury and just going by the figures coming from the industry themselves on how much nitrogen is lost from the Canterbury region and from intensive dairy farming, then you would have to pay $12 billion at that same rate. If we want to protect those Canterbury lakes and rivers the same way that we protect Lake Rotorua, then there's $12 billion. Well, the whole dairy industry is probably supposed to be worth just over that per year for the whole country. And yet, so that shows how much we subsidise that stupid industry in this country. And you guys will know as well as I do that that questioning dairy in this country is treasonous almost. Dissing dairy or dissing rugby in this country is dangerous territory to get into, But yet it's so blatant how stupid the whole system is, because there's so many more things to add into that, like the fact that we use coal, that milk then gets dried, most of it gets dried and shipped off as an additive to junk food overseas and a product that replaces breast milk overseas on a massive scale. And we to get it into that form, to do that, we burn massive amounts of coal. The whole thing from the greenhouse gas, the fossil fuel fertilizer to drive the intensive system, then the fossil fuels that are used to dry the milk out, then the ethical issues around where that stuff ends up. The whole thing is just like this big secret dodgy thing that we're up to that nobody wants to talk about. But you mentioned the aluminium. So that's to flock out the phosphate. So the two nutrients that cause problems in lakes are phosphate and nitrogen. The two core kind of the key to growing any plants are those two core things. Is what plants need lots of. But in the case of phosphate, you can get it out of the water by flocculation, which is what they use the aluminium for. Basically, if you imagine, it's like the aluminium particles attract the phosphate and they clump around it, and then it makes it heavy and it falls out. So if you add aluminium to water that's high in phosphate, you'll get the phosphate dropping out. And then so you go from one problem of an organic pollutant that's in there called phosphate, then you turn it into a toxic one by adding aluminium to it. So then you have this, it falls out onto the bed of the lake, and you've just created a non-organic, potentially very dangerous mixture. It makes the lake clearer, but it's just a very, very toxic stopgap measure. It's just kidding yourself. It's so fake. It's crazy.
Oh, wow, it blew my mind when I was first learning about this, and it was just kind of a case of, I wanted to make my one arm look longer, so I'll cut off the other one.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just absolutely bizarre how
our clean green dairy industry is actually what is ruining completely our clean greenness.
And one thing we were talking about this just the other day was how a lot of us, we like to say, like, I don't support factory farms, and then there'll be people say, I only support, the organic and stuff like that. But I kind of feel like out here in New Zealand, despite having the rolling green hills, it all looks very old MacDonald, but really it's just outdoor factory farms. Would you sort of agree with that?
Yeah, no, that's it. I mean, that's what people have to understand, that, if you go back when I was dairy farming, more than 40 years ago, we didn't put any of those inputs on, and it was much more of that, you imagine. But the stocking rate was less than half of what it is now. I mean, that's the thing you just don't see when you're looking at, rolling green hills and things. Well, what you should see is that there's this monoculture, and people should realize that any monoculture is totally unnatural and will undoubtedly have lots of problems go with it. It's a pretty simple way of understanding a system, is that the further it is away from a natural system, and so a monoculture of ryegrass is a problem. But that the cows on paddocks is not a problem. It's the intensity of cows on paddocks, and the intensity is there because we artificially boost that stocking rate by the fertilizers. So we import phosphate from, and there's a whole lot of ethical issues around that phosphate that's in the news at the moment. It's stolen property. There's a whole lot of cultural issues that go with that. And we're the only country in the world that's taking that West Saharan phosphate. We are the biggest single importer of palm kernel. So the other way we keep those stocking rates up really high is palm kernel. The byproduct of one of the most damaging industries in the world, one of the biggest impacts on biodiversity and on human and with forest clearance on climate change as well. There's everything is bad about palm kernel, and yet we are the biggest importer of that. 2-point-something million tons of it yearly we bring in to feed cows to keep that stocking rate so high. So, there's no, I mean, as hard as I try, there's no good stories in there. There's the employment situation where it's very hard to get the numbers, but the last figures I got from the South Island were that 70% of the farm workers on dairy farms in the South Island are people from overseas, so people who are more desperate than New Zealanders and will work, for less pay and in worse conditions than New Zealanders. So at every step, it's just, there's nothing good to be said about it.
Yeah, I can completely vouch what you're saying. I actually worked on dairy farms myself for many years. beginning around the 90s. I remember when palm kernel first became kind of a thing, and our boss, were in the South Waikato, and he had us feeding out massive amounts of palm kernel. He was like, this is brilliant. It's really cheap feed, and it's from a waste product.
Yeah, waste product, yeah.
Yeah, and that was, of course, that was sort of the early 90s, before anyone really kind of knew of the effects of the whole palm kernel and palm oil thing. But
yeah, and the other thing with that is that the part of the reason it's cheap is that all those ships that are coming, so all of those pine logs, and there's a whole other environmental story with palm, but the whole we ship out huge amounts of unprocessed pine logs to that part of the world, and so those ships would be coming back empty, so it's a backload for them, so they'll bring back palm kernel at a reduced rate, because it's kind of subsidizing another dodgy industry that we're involved in. Two of the probably worst things that we do, exporting whole pine logs and exporting milk powder, two of the most kind of giving away our valuable rivers, lakes, and landscapes to two sort of food and fiber kind of, I mean, that's probably pushing, but they're both incredibly unsustainable, and they're linked together in some ways like that, where they're sharing the same transport system to get the logs out and the palm kernel back again.
Yeah, I never even considered those two products, actually, with the pine or the palm kernel. And yeah, it's crazy stuff going on. And like you say, when I was farming, it was a very desirable thing in the 90s. That was what all young people were urged to do. It was a safe, it was a secure and wholesome job. It's very different these days. We have young people now that are just like, I don't want to get up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning and go milk cows. I'll go do something else. So it's completely true what you're saying about, the farm workers. A lot of us are no longer Kiwis.
Yeah, and I mean, the other end of that, the kind of dairy farming where the successful low intensity farms that are once a day. I don't know if you've ever visited any of them, but they're so different. Well, for a start, the cows and the people and the animals and the dogs, as well as the cow, everybody's much more relaxed than on a high intensity 2 or 3 times a day milking farm. So they go to that once a day, low intensity, low input. You don't have to milk the cows. I think they mostly milk them at 10 o'clock in the morning or something like that, and of course the cows are much happier. There's way less stress on them because there's way less inputs. I mean, there was another thing that people, I think, forget, and I was reminded about with work I was doing with Landcorp on part of their environmental reference group, but lactating cows are a different, I don't know what, some stupid metaphor here, but they're like a factory. They're running at full noise because they're producing that milk, and so they're eating a lot, they're drinking a lot, because they've got to pump out these huge amounts of this very high protein milk, and so their waste production is matches that production. So for example, when one of the farms could halve the nitrogen loss by not halving the herd, but halving the milking herd. The number of animals on the farm didn't change, but there was a whole lot of bull steers replacing cows. So they milked less cows, kept the really best of those cows. So production barely dropped at all. The stocking, the bulls or the steers, their nitrate loss is a fraction of a lactating cow, for 2 things, and one of them's quite a funny physiological thing, that having a penis and kind of wandering along and peeing at the same time and spraying it, compared to that big gush that comes from a cow, and so it's that's the kind of thing for people to understand, why it seems natural to have animals on the land, right? And it's very hard people to make a link between, how could that be harmful? But it's the intensity, but also, thinking about when a cow urinates and she just pours all that water that urine into one spot, very high in urea, that it just can't be absorbed by the plants. Most of it goes down because it's too much in one spot. If she had a sprinkler on her back end, well, this is why having them inside or on a pad can make a big difference, where you can catch that urine and then spread it evenly over the land, and then you can get that your nitrogen back to grow plants again. And so again, why this kind of magic, grass-fed outside idea sounds good, but actually isn't. I'm not trying to support the industry, but because I think it's unnecessary in the first place, and a stupid waste of everything. But if you are going to do it at that intensity, then getting the cows off the land has a way of reducing some of that harm. But then it's all like all these things. You fix one thing and you cause another problem. So you bring them inside and put them in a shed, and there's ethical issues and all kinds of things and animal welfare issues. But from an environmental perspective, then you drastically increase the nitrous oxide production when you do that. So if you have urine lying around in tanks and being spread on the land and volatilizing, you have big increase in nitrous oxide, which I mentioned before is 300 times more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So you can kind of ease off on one nitrate to water problem, but then you do a nitrogen to atmosphere problem, which is increased when you switch to the other one. So again, it's like, sending a spider to catch a fly. Don't do it in the first place, and then you don't have to do any of these things, because it's a dumb thing to do anyway.
Yeah,
it just gets dumber.
Definitely.
Like in a previous interview that you did with the Lentil Intervention podcast, and we'll have to link that because it's an absolutely brilliant one that you did recently. You're saying about you've been to some of these farming conferences and stuff. It's absolutely great to see that younger farmers are starting to look at the alternatives, whether it's regenerative farming. Of course, here at Vegan FTA, we kind of want it all gone. But, I think it's great to be there and be presenting solutions, as opposed to, like for us in the vegan movement, we're very happy to tell you all the problems and say what's going wrong with things. But yeah, I think it's very important that we get to these presentations and then also offer those solutions for what they can do else with the land, where they can move to. But another thing you touched on in that interview, though, was about the whole financial entrapment that does come with farming, because a lot of these farmers, it's long hours, hard work. They get it handed down from their parents or grandparents, the family farm, but then they're millions of dollars in debt. Could you just, for our viewers, explain a little bit about, well, how I view it anyway, it's financial entrapment, these people that are locked into the system. Yeah,
I can vouch for that too, actually. I know people that are millions of dollars in debt, $4 million owing to the bank before they're 40.
Yeah, I know. And I know people that owe way more than that too. And and the problem is that, well, part of the problem is this kind of idea that banks have, or economists, and it's kind of, I don't like to say that, like lump everybody together, but there is definitely an idea out there in the financial world that farms are like factories, and they think that, maybe, if I had a factory and I was making, I don't know, biros or something like that, and as long as I had a market for biros, and as long as I had, if you keep putting more plastic and ink and stuff together, then, there's a straight line relationship between production and productivity and profit. But farms are biological systems, and they don't work like that. It's not a straight line relationship. There's a natural limits to what can be produced. So you pump them up to a certain level and you increase production and profit. But then it plateaus, and then the more stuff you pour on, you don't get anything. In fact, because it's costing you more, your productivity starts to decline. And you can see this at every level. So for all farming in New Zealand and Dairy New Zealand numbers, you can see that there has been a plateau in productivity, and it's starting to decline. It's declined over the last 15 years because more has been added, but less is coming out of the system. And so now we're with these incredibly high debt levels, because I just was thinking of an example of farming friends who have started to reduce fertilizer inputs and had panic calls from the bank manager who's monitoring their spending, because they've got this massive mortgage on the farm, saying, "Oi, what are you doing? You can't," because in their mind, what goes in is, they're thinking of the biofactory, not the natural system. They don't get it that adding more stuff doesn't, you can reduce hugely your inputs, and profit actually goes up. I mean, I gave an example, if any of the viewers wanted to look at my book, Polluted Inheritance, the Bridget Williams textbook, Polluted Inheritance. And I give the example of some farms around Massey that students were working on there, where you could almost halve the number of cows on that farm and have the same amount of profit. So as you go backwards from that, it was 620 cows I think they had on that farm, and you reduce cows and you go back, and the profit goes up and the profit goes up. And then, of course, as you go really down in cow numbers, then it starts to reduce again. But where they matched up, where that curve came back and lined up with the 620 cows, was 380 cows, and you made exactly the same amount of money without all that expenditure and stress and worry and all that kind of thing. These systems that are just pushed. So the latest Reserve Bank figures showed that for all agriculture in New Zealand, then the productivity's been declining, but 35% of dairy farms in New Zealand had debt levels of $35 or more per kilogram of milk solids produced. So that meant that they have to be paid was between $6.20 and $6.50 per kilogram to break even. So the milk price has to be $6.20 to $6.50 just to break even. So that's not paying, like all of that intensive extra work just to pay interest to overseas banks. So a huge amount of this harm that's being done in New Zealand is not making New Zealanders richer. It's not making the farmers richer. It's making banks richer, making bank profit levels higher. That's another part of the whole crazy, kind of system that, it's not just in the farming sector. Look at housing and all that kind of stuff where it's all about capital gains, but that's what's driving a lot of that problem in agriculture. So yeah, you're trapped into the system where you owe so much money, you can't even back away from it.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be quite hard to, pretty much impossible to make a change as well if the banks are so indoctrinated in that, the dairy industry is the way to go. It's progressive, it's growing, it's always going to be here. And if you're $4 million in debt, for example, like the person that I know, and then all of a sudden you decide that you do want to change, and you go to the bank and say, actually, no, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go and grow hemp or oats or something like that. Yeah. Can you imagine the reception they get from the bank?
Yeah. That's right. I know. So it's a horrible, horrible trap that they're in. I really feel for those people. I that's the thing I want to make clear too, is that I don't blame the farmers for this situation. Most of them are just doing, they're working incredibly hard. They're working within a system. The system is wrong, but they're stuck with that system, and it's not them that need to change. It's the regulators. It's the industry that needs to change. It's I've written a book chapter that I can share with your listeners too, if you want, called Deadly Nitrogen Addiction. Sure. And we're addicted to it. In the same way that drug pushers will give you, the product, and once you're hooked on it, they've got you. That's exactly what's happened with the fertilizer industry. Once you start applying nitrate fertilizer at nitrogen fertilizer, then the whole soil biology changes. And you have to keep putting it on, because you will have problems if you try to go cold turkey. You will be your soils will be really unwell because they're out of balance because you've been adding this stuff for so long, So it's a classic kind of, and the similarities between cigarette smoking and fertilizer use and the kind of tobacco science that comes from the ag industry, the fertilizer companies, where they deny all the problems, and it's just straight out of the tobacco industry's book for denial and cover-ups, and there's and climate change as well with big oil and fossil fuel companies. They use the same tactics to keep people trapped in those systems.
Yeah. I think it's especially from our stance, it's not making an excuse for, the system or how these people are. It's just, I think it's really important for, on our side, our activists to understand that this is the kind of thing that farmers are going through. And so I personally believe what we need to be doing is we need to be offering that helping hand in order to get towards a brighter future. Like it's sometimes, like there's been recent cases out here where there's been a farmer beating this cow and stuff like that. We need to really, scream out about stuff like that. But we also, for the majority of the farmers, we need to be working together, work towards a brighter future. And it kind of leads us on to what we want to talk about next is a lot of us, we picked up a hobby during lockdown, or we upskilled in some form. And you went ahead and started writing up the Better Futures Forum, a brighter projection for New Zealand. And I'd love to talk about that a bit more because, how did you end up coming up with the Brighter Futures Forum, BFFS, isn't
Better
it?
Futures, my love.
Oh, Better Futures, yeah. BFF, yeah.
Yeah.
But bright is great, yeah. I mean, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, it just comes from that frustration with seeing how we could. That's always what makes it really hard, I think, being a Kiwi and knowing what we're capable of and what we could be doing here, and yet we just seem to do with the worst, take the worst from the overseas and use it. But I was just trying to envisage. Well, I mean, I guess, and it wasn't just me; it was some friends as well. But we were kind of the shock of how much we changed in such a short time. When it came to that lockdown, nothing was impossible, right? We could just stop what we were doing and everything could change. And yet, on the scheme of things, COVID is pretty small in comparison with the impacts of climate change and the impacts of even what we're doing with agriculture in the world. But because it was immediate and you can kind of measure it, then, we reacted. And so it was kind of a hopefulness that came out of that if we could just visualize for people the better world that we could have, like it's so easy to portray the changes that we need to make as a negative thing. And yet, if you go to places in the world where people do live in harmony with nature and the environment, then they are much, much nicer places to live. And that, the symptoms of how stuffed up our system is, whether it's, with social, with drug use, with mental health, with, ecosystem health, all those kind of things, there is nothing good about what we have at the moment. We're going in completely the wrong direction. So it was kind of trying to come up with a picture for how the world could be a lot better if we used that opportunity of COVID to make the changes that we need to make.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's one of the great things that we love doing about this series, that a lot of we have to talk about a lot of serious stuff, a lot of nasty, negative stuff that we all wish wasn't happening. But it's great that there are just so many people out there like yourself that are just working and fighting so hard to make change and to make things better and to have a better future. And one excellent focus of the project that we really like is you're working with the Maori community and just integrating that Indigenous knowledge and understanding. And it's so great that you're doing that. And I could imagine it would be really valuable as well. Could you explain a little bit about this aspect and bringing that all together?
Yeah, and I was going to say, if you could link, or I'll send you the link to that, that I just put together that little story of how the world, the vision for 1 year's time. I was obviously tongue in cheek, but I mean, it gives you an idea. But yeah, I mean, a part of that coming together for the Better Futures Forum was how a bunch of we call ourselves systems thinkers. I think that's what we had in common, is that we understand and we think in systems, how everything is interconnected, and from a Western science point of view, we call that systems thinking. Goes back to the Meadows and Herman Daly and a few others that they sort of thought about these things in the past and came up with that term. But I'm totally aware that Indigenous knowledge is exactly the same thing. and we just put a fancy word on it, but it's actually exactly the same as Indigenous knowledge, and Māori, understanding and worldview just fits in so perfectly with that systems view, where we are part of a completely interconnected system, and you can't isolate these issues and try and treat them on their own. We are in the system is us, and whether it's lakes or rivers and identity that Māori have with places and with lineage and whakapapa, we are all part of that. And so it's not a clash. Like there's this clash portrayed between Western science and Indigenous knowledge, and it exists for sure if you live in a reductionist scientist view where you're a chemist or you are a physicist or something, and you're working in this really narrow space where you've reduced down to a nanoparticle of some sort or some chemical, but you at this higher level where ecologists work, it's all about understanding that interconnectedness. And so I think that was one of the major things about the Better Futures Forum was that we have to make sure that when we think about what we have to do, how interlinked all of these things are.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. And for many of our viewers, they may well be overseas. And I know we're talking a lot about New Zealand here, and especially in this case, the Maori, which are the Indigenous. I really hope people can see this and take some of the knowledge and apply it to their own areas, because it's so important. Like a lot of these facts have been based through New Zealand throughout this episode, but you've got to look at what's going on in your own country and how you can be working together in those systems, to use our word for it,
Yeah.
And do you hope that a initiative like this might be something that will get overseas in due time, or at least there'll be global variations of it?
Well, I think there already are. I mean, there's people around the world that are working in a similar space, and there is a proportion of the world, of the people of the world, and I don't know what that number might be, who understand the problems or want to understand. Actually, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and somebody talking about being it's like being awake to these issues, and I don't mean woke, but I mean at the time that it takes from the time you realize, and I'm sure you guys have been on a similar kind of pathway, where you start to you get a glimmer of something happening, and then it's like that's when your eyes are first starting to open up, and then it takes time. You sort of go down all these rabbit holes and things that take you in the wrong direction, but eventually you start to see how it all connects up. And then you start, and I feel like I've been awake for 24 hours, because if I look back to what I was saying 5 years ago, even, I was kind of not seeing the whole picture, and I don't see the whole picture now, but the further along you get it and you realize, so from a global perspective, when it comes to animal agriculture, it is the biggest, environmental issue that we face, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or, pollution, all the way through. And that huge role that animals and nitrogen fertilizer play in the harm, but also that they are what got our population to this extreme level it is, our global population. So, I mean, if you look at the sums that have been done on just taking away nitrogen fertilizer, you would feed way less than half the population of the world at the moment. I mean, that's under our current system, where we waste half the food, and a huge amount of the food goes to feed animals instead of us, and all that kind of thing. So the reality of carbon neutral, which is what we have to do if we want to survive, is that we're going to have to eat. I mean, I totally understand and agree with all of the reasons that people have for being vegans and not wanting to have animals involved in food and all that kind of thing. But even if you put all of that aside, from a purely practical energy transfer, which is what it's about the energy that we need to stay alive, plus some other, obviously some macronutrients and other things in there. If you're going to feed anywhere like the population that we have, or what we propose to have, you just can't have animals in it. It just does not compute. The amount of energy coming in and the amount of energy required by that many people just to keep their systems running, you just can't have them. So people can make out like it's a choice, but it isn't a choice. And the sooner that we when we're, of course, like everything else, we're not even beginning to reduce that. There's a lot more awareness around the impacts of animal agriculture, but there's no reduction in the amount of animal food that's going into diets globally. So we have to. It's a reality of it's a them or us situation, and so it's going to have to be a big change that's going to happen.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really inevitable, isn't it? But in the meantime, while we're waiting for everybody else to wake up, what can people like us do? And the average, the viewers watching, the average person around the world that doesn't currently own a farm or anything like that. Thank goodness. But what can we do every day to help you in your goal to make the world a better place?
Oh, well, I mean, clearly the simplest, easiest thing that people can do is, I know your audience is probably already doing this, but, without a doubt, getting animals out of our diet is a massive step that we have to make, and it's something that we can do as individuals that will have way more impact than anything else we do in our lives. Then, from that point onwards, it's about consumption. It's about reducing consumption. So, everything, mainly energy that we consume. It's about reducing the amount of energy we consume, which is tied up in, vehicles and junk that we buy and all that kind of thing. It's about reducing our impact on the planet by reducing our consumption and learning to live with natural products and living with less and enjoying, living with less and questioning all of those ideas like that, you have to go on holidays overseas and that it's not, you're not cool if you're not doing all that stuff. I mean, right through to, we got to stop idolizing, people who make lots of money. Is this kind of winner-loser thing is so bizarre, he's a loser, or he's a leader, he's fantastic because she's made a whole lot of money. That is not a prerequisite for anything of value is making lots of money. It's because you can guarantee that there's just been a whole lot of harm done in making all that money. And so, that's part of the basic shift that we have to have, where it did come out of the COVID lockdown thing, that there was some realization that those people that we pay the least in society are the ones that are most crucial to us. And all of the unpaid work is actually the most crucial part of our existence. And yet, in our system and in our values where we call people winners and losers, then it's completely back to front, totally back to front. The people with the money at the top that we seem to think are magic and put on all these panels and boards and idolize are actually the problem, and the people at the other end of the scale who are paid the least or paid not at all are the really important people in life. And that's a crucial change that we have to make.
Thank you for watching this episode. If you would like to support our speaker, then follow the links provided in the description. If you're enjoying this content, then please subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave a like on some of our videos and drop some comments with the things that you've been learning from this series. We really appreciate all your love and support, and we can't wait to bring you the next episode. Thank you.